हेलो गाइस, वेलकम बैक टू लॉस्टॉर्मिंग प्लेटफॉर्म। मैं हूं शालिनी और आज के इस वीडियो में हम डील करेंगे परफॉर्मेंस ऑफ कॉन्ट्रैक्ट से। अगर आपने इसके पहले के कॉन्ट्रैक्ट के वीडियोस को नहीं देखा है देन उसका लिंक आपको नीचे डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स और ऊपर कार्ड पे मिल जाएगा। प्लीज वॉच दैट बिफोर वॉचिंग दिस वीडियो। नाउ विदाउट फर्दर ado, let's get started. So section 37 of the Indian Contract Act talks about obligation of parties to contract. So ये section बोलता है कि the parties to contract are obligated to perform their respective promises, और अगर वो ऐसा नहीं करते हैं, if they default in performing their promises, then the same amounts to breach of contract under section 73 of the Indian Contract Act. So section 37 says that the parties to a contract must either perform or offer to perform their respective promises unless such performance is dispensed with or excused under the provision of this act or any other law. So section 37 says कि parties should either perform their promise or offer to perform their promise, and this offer to perform equates to tender of performance. The section further says that the promises bind the representative of the promiser in case of death of such promiser before performance unless a contrary intention appear from the contract. So the parties under the Indian Contract Act are bound to perform their part of the promises, and if they default in doing the same, or then in that case it amounts to breach of contract, or if the parties die before they could perform their promise, then in that scenario the representative of the promiser is bound by the contract and is supposed to perform the same. All right. So section 37 of the Contract Act now talks about performance. Now according to this section, there are two types of performance: actual performance and attempted performance. So actual performance अब क्या होता है? Actual performance of the contract means the actual discharge of the liability or obligation which the promiser had undertaken to perform. So जो भी liability या obligation थी promiser की, he has actually fulfilled that obligation और अब उसको कोई भी task नहीं करना है. So the task or the performance is completed. All right, so this is actual performance. Attempted performance क्या होता है? जहाँ पे performance becomes due and the promiser in this case is prevented by the promisee from performing the same. तो उस disability के वजह से he is now not able to perform the contract, but he has attempted to do the same and therefore it is known as attempted performance. और attempted performance को ही हम tender बोलते हैं. All right. Let's understand tender of performance in a greater detail. So जहाँ पे the offerer offers the performance of an obligation. He's not actually performing the obligation, but he's offering the performance of an obligation under the contract to the offeree. That is known as tender of performance. Now, when the offerer offers the performance of an obligation, उस केस में promisee के पास अब option है either to accept the offer or to reject the offer. Now, if he rejects the offer or chooses not to accept the offer, then उस केस में जो offerer है, he does not lose his right under the contract and neither is he liable for non-performance of the term of contract. Alright, so he is not liable for non-performance and neither does he loses his right under the term of contract. Let's understand this. So it is a settled principle that if this non-acceptance of tender of performance, then that would result in the exclusion of the promiser from further performance of the promise of the contract, and he is also entitled to sue the other party, that is the promisee, for not performing the term of the contract. And section 38 of the Contract Act makes it clear that tender of performance actually tantamounts to performance, and therefore agar promisee has prevented the promiser from performing his part of the obligation, then he is liable under section 38. Let's look at section 38 now. Let's understand section 38. It says effective refusal to accept offer of performance. So where a promiser has made an offer of performance to the promisee and the offer has not been accepted, उस केस में the promiser is not responsible for non-performance, nor does he thereby lose his right under the contract. So section 38 basically effect बताता है of refusal of tender of performance. If the promisee has refused the tender of performance, then उस केस में promiser ना ही responsible है for non-performance and ना ही he loses his right under the contract. However, there are certain conditions that must be fulfilled. The first condition is that the offer should be unconditional. Secondly, the offer must be made at a proper time and place, so that जो ऑफरी है वो ascertain कर सके that the person who is making the offer to him is competent to enter into a contract. And thirdly, अगर offer is to deliver some goods addressed to the offeree, then उस केस में offerer को reasonable time देना होगा offeree को to ascertain कि जो goods हैं, the goods that are offered to the offeree is the same by which the offerer is bound under the terms of the contract. All right. After this, let's look at section 39. It talks about effect of refusal of party to perform promise wholly. जहाँ पे a party to a contract has refused to perform or disabled himself from performing his promise in its entirety, उस केस में the promisee may put an end to the contract unless he has signified by words or conduct his acquiescence in its continuance. ठीक है, तो जहाँ पे जो अगर promiser has defaulted in performance of his promise, तो उस केस में in entirety, उस केस में promisee के पास right है to put an end to the contract and also seek for damages. However, he cannot do so if he has later consented to that, to the continuance of that event. Let's take an illustration. A singer, enters into a contract with B, the manager of a theatre, to sing at his theatre 2 nights in every week during the next 2 months. And B engages to pay her at the rate of ₹100 for each night. Now on the 6th night, A willfully absent herself. So now as per this section, on the 6th night, B के पास option है to end the contract and also ask for damages. However, if with the consent of B, A sings on the 7th night, then B उस case में loses his right. However, he still has the right to ask or seek for compensation or damage for the damage that is sustained by him through A's failure to sing on the 6th night. All right. Now, by whom the contract must be performed. So section 40 says that person by whom promise is to be performed. So if it appears from the nature of the case that it was intention of the parties to any contract that a particular promise contained in it should be performed by the promiser himself, then उस case में such promise must be performed by the promiser. And in any other case, the promiser or his representative may employ a competent person to perform it. So section 41 talks about effect of accepting performance from third person. When a promisee accepts performance of promise from a third person, तो फिर later he cannot enforce it against the promiser. ठीक है, तो अगर initially promiser ने promise किया है that he'll perform certain promise, but promisee has already taken the performance from a third party, तो फिर he cannot enforce that contract against the promiser. After this, look at joint promises. So section 42 talks about devolution of joint liability. It says when two or more persons have made a joint promise, then unless a contrary intention appears to the contract, all such person during their joint life and after the death of any of them, his representative, jointly with the survivor or survivors, and after the death of the last survivor, the representative of all jointly must fulfill the promise. So this section says कि जहाँ पे two or more person have made a joint promise, then उस scenario में all of them are liable. And now if any one of the promiser dies, then उस scenario में the survivors along with the representative of that promiser is liable. If all of the promisers die, then उस scenario में representative of all are jointly liable to fulfill the promise. ठीक है? So this section in a way provides security to the promisee and ensures कि even after the death of the promiser, their representative will be bound by the promise made by the deceased promiser. All right. After this, now the section further says that any one of the joint promisers may be compelled to perform. So जहाँ पे two or more person make a joint promise, उस scenario में the promisee may, in the absence of express agreement to the contrary, compel any one or more of such joint promiser to perform the whole of the promise. और जहाँ पे सिर्फ one or more have performed the entire promise, they can ask for or compel for contribution from other joint promiser. This is what the section further says. After this, the section talks about sharing of loss by default and contribution. So if any of two or more joint promiser makes default in such contribution, then जो remaining joint promises हैं, they must bear the loss arising from such default in equal share. All right. After this, section 44 talks about effect of release of one joint promiser. So where two or more person have made a joint promise, then अगर promisee ने किसी एक को release कर दिया है, किसी एक joint promiser को, then that does not discharge the other joint promisers. ठीक है, पहला पार्ट तो ये है इस सेक्शन का कि अगर promisee ने किसी एक joint promiser को या एक से ज़्यादा joint promiser को release कर दिया, it does not mean all of them are discharged. And the second part says neither does it free the joint promisers so released from the responsibility to the other joint promiser or joint promises. तो जिसको promisee ने release कर दिया है, even that promiser now is liable to other joint promiser. His obligation is not fulfilled towards other joint promiser. He's still liable towards them. All right. Now let's look at section 45. It talks about devolution of joint right. Similarly, just as devolution of joint liability, when a person has made a promise to two or more persons jointly, then unless a contrary intention appear from the contract, the right to claim performance rests as between him and them, with them during their joint lives, and after the death of any of them, with the representative of such deceased person jointly with the survivor or survivors, and agar sabki death ho jati hai, then with the representative of all jointly. Alright, with this we have come to an end of the video. Hope you liked the video. If you did, please like, share, comment and subscribe to Lawstorming. Thank you.